Chapter 1. The Horror in Clay. The kindest thing in the world, I believe, is the incapacity of the human mind to connect all its contents. We dwell on a calm island of ignorance amid vast black oceans of infinity, and it was never intended that we should travel far. The sciences, each pushing forward in its own direction, have so far done us little harm. Yet one day the linking together of scattered knowledge will reveal such terrifying vistas of reality, and our awful place within it, that we will either lose our sanity from the disclosure or escape from the deadly light into the calm and security of a new dark age. Theosophists have speculated about the immense grandeur of the cosmic cycle in which our world and humanity are merely passing episodes. They have suggested odd remnants in terms that would chill the blood if not softened by gentle optimism. But it was not from them that I received that single glimpse of forbidden ages which freezes me when I recall it and drives me mad, in dreams. That glimpse, like every dreadful revelation of truth, emerged from the chance connection of separate facts, in this instance, an old newspaper clipping and the notes of a deceased professor. I pray no one else ever makes such a connection. Certainly, if I survive, I will never knowingly provide a link in so monstrous a chain. I suspect the professor also meant to remain silent about what he knew, and that sudden death alone prevented him from destroying his notes. My awareness of the matter began in the winter of 1926-27 with the passing of my great-uncle George, Gamel Angel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages at Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angel was renowned as an expert on ancient inscriptions and often consulted by directors of major museums. Thus his death at 92 would be remembered by many. Locally, curiosity was heightened by the mysterious circumstances of his demise. He collapsed while returning from the Newport ferry, suddenly falling, as witnesses reported, after being bumped by a sailor-like black man who emerged from one of the strange shadowy alleys on the steep hillside that served as a shortcut from the docks to the professor's home on Williams Street. Doctors found no obvious cause but, after puzzled discussion, decided a hidden heart condition, worsened by the strenuous climb for such an elderly man, had ended his life. At the time I saw no cause to challenge this verdict, but lately I have begun to doubt, and more than doubt. As my great-uncle's sole heir and executor, he was a childless widower. I was obliged to examine his documents thoroughly, and for that reason I transported his entire collection of files and cabinets to my home in Boston. Much of what I assembled will later appear in publications of the American Archaeological Society, but one locked box struck me as deeply puzzling, and I was strongly reluctant to show it to anyone else. I could not locate the key until I thought to check the personal keyring he always kept in his pocket. Opening it only revealed a more secure and intimate barrier. For what sense could be made of the strange clay relief and the scattered scribbles, ramblings, and clippings inside? Had my uncle, in his final years, fallen for the shallowest deceptions? I decided to track down the odd sculptor behind this apparent disruption of an elderly scholar's tranquility. The relief was a crude oblong slab less than an inch thick and roughly 5 by 6 inches across, clearly modern in make. Its motifs, however, were anything but modern in tone or implication, for while the excesses of cubism and futurism are numerous and bizarre, they rarely recreate the secret regularity hidden in prehistoric script. And script of some sort most of these designs certainly appeared to be, though my recollection, despite extensive familiarity with my uncle's papers and collections, could neither identify this variety nor suggest its remotest connections. Above these seeming hieroglyphs stood a figure plainly meant to be pictorial, though its impressionistic style prevented any precise understanding of its nature. It appeared to be a kind of monster, or emblem of a monster, of a type only a sick imagination could devise. If I say that my rather vivid fancy simultaneously conjured images of an octopus, a dragon, and a human parody, I will not stray from the essence of the object. A soft, tentacled head crowned a grotesque, scaly torso with rudimentary wings, yet it was the overall contour that rendered it most unnervingly horrific. Behind the figure lurked a vague hint of colossal architecture. The papers accompanying this curiosity, apart from a pile of newspaper cuttings, were in Professor Angle's latest handwriting and showed no attempt at literary polish. The principal document was titled Cthulhu Cult, in carefully printed capitals to prevent misreading so unfamiliar a word. The manuscript fell into two parts, the first headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS meeting, notes on same, and Professor Webb's account. The remaining papers were brief memoranda, some recording bizarre dreams of various individuals, others quoting theosophical works and journals, especially W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, and the rest discussing enduring secret societies and concealed cults, with citations from classics like Fraser's Golden Bough and Margaret Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The clippings mostly concerned extreme mental disturbances and outbreaks of collective madness in the spring of 1925. The first section of the main manuscript recounted a highly unusual story. On March 1, 1925, a slender, dark young man of nervous and agitated appearance visited Professor Angel carrying the peculiar clay relief, which was then still very moist and new. His calling card read Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle recognized him as the youngest son of a respectable family he knew slightly, a student of sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design who lived alone in the nearby Fleur-de-Lis building. Wilcox was a gifted but highly eccentric youth who, since childhood, had drawn attention with the odd tales and strange dreams he habitually shared. He described himself as psychically hypersensitive, though the conservative residents of the old commercial city regarded him simply as odd. Having drifted away from most social circles, he was now known only to a small circle of aesthetes from other cities. Even the Providence Art Club, eager to maintain its traditionalism, had declared him hopeless. According to the professor's notes, during this visit the sculptor abruptly requested help in deciphering the hieroglyphs on the relief, appealing to his host's archaeological expertise. He spoke in a dreamy, affected way that suggested pretense and repelled sympathy. My uncle responded rather sharply, for the obvious newness of the slab suggested anything but antiquity. Young Wilcox's reply, so striking that my uncle recalled and recorded it word for word, possessed a fantastically poetic quality that evidently characterized all his speech, and which I later found typical of him. He declared, "It is new, yes, for I fashioned it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." Then he launched into the rambling account that suddenly stirred a dormant memory and seized my uncle's keen interest. A minor earthquake had occurred the previous night, the strongest felt in New England for years, and Wilcox's imagination had responded intensely. Falling asleep, he experienced an unprecedented vision of vast cyclopean cities built of Titan blocks and towering monoliths, all oozing green slime and pulsing with hidden dread. Hieroglyphs covered walls and pillars, and from some depth below issued a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic impression that only imagination could translate into sound, which he tried to reproduce with the nearly unpronounceable sequence, Cthulhu Mythos. This nonsense phrase unlocked the memory that both excited and unsettled Professor Angel. He interrogated the sculptor with scientific precision and examined the relief, which the young man had unconsciously worked on, chilled and in nightclothes, upon waking, with near-frantic focus. My uncle later blamed his age, Wilcox said, for his delay in recognizing both the hieroglyphs and the image. Many questions seemed irrelevant to the visitor, especially those attempting to link him to unusual sects or groups. Wilcox failed to grasp the repeated offers of silence in return for admitting membership in some widespread esoteric or pagan organization. Once convinced the sculptor truly knew nothing of any cult or hidden lore, Professor Angel pressed him for ongoing dream reports. This produced steady results, as the manuscript records daily visits after the first interview, during which the young man described startling fragments of night visions always centered on colossal dark dripping stone and a subterranean voice or intelligence monotonously chanting enigmatic sensations expressible only as gibberish. The syllables most often repeated were rendered as Cthulhu and Orlia. On March 23 the manuscript notes that Wilcox did not appear. Inquiries at his residence revealed he had fallen ill with an unexplained fever and been taken to his family home on Waterman Street. He had cried out during the night, disturbing other artists in the building, and since then alternated between unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle immediately telephoned the family and thereafter followed the case closely, often visiting Dr. Toby's office on Thayer Street, whom he learned was attending the patient. The fevered mind of the youth, it seemed, was filled with strange matters. The doctor occasionally shuddered while recounting them. They included not only repetitions of earlier dreams but wild references to a gigantic entity miles tall, that walked or lumbered. He never fully described it, but scattered frantic phrases reported by Dr. Toby convinced the professor it matched the nameless horror the youth had sculpted in his dream. Mention of this entity, the doctor noted, always preceded the patient's lapse into lethargy. Curiously, his temperature remained barely elevated, yet the overall symptoms suggested genuine fever more than mere mental disturbance. On April 2, around 3 p.m., all signs of Wilcox's illness abruptly vanished. He sat up in bed, bewildered to find himself at home and entirely unaware of events in dream or reality since the night of March 22. Declared recovered by his physician, he returned to his rooms in 3 days, but he could offer Professor Angel no further insight. All traces of unusual dreaming had disappeared with his health, and my uncle ceased recording nocturnal thoughts after a week of mundane and irrelevant reports. Here the first portion of the manuscript ends, though references in scattered notes provided me ample food for thought, so much that only the stubborn skepticism then shaping my outlook explains my lingering distrust of the artist. The notes described dreams of various people during the same period as Wilcox's strange experiences. My uncle had evidently sent wide-ranging inquiries to nearly every acquaintance he could approach without seeming intrusive, requesting reports of nightly dreams and dates of any remarkable visions in recent months. Responses varied, but he received more replies than most men could manage without assistance. The original letters were not kept, but his summaries formed a comprehensive and meaningful compilation. Ordinary citizens and businessmen, New England's sturdy, salt of the earth, reported almost nothing, though isolated instances of vague uneasy night impressions appeared, always between March 23 and April 2, the span of the sculptor's delirium. Scientists were scarcely more affected, though 4 vague accounts hinted at fleeting strange landscapes, and one mentioned fear of something unnatural. It was artists and poets who supplied the relevant replies, and panic would surely have erupted had they compared notes. Lacking the original letters, I half suspected my uncle of posing leading questions or editing responses to support a preconceived theory. Thus I persisted in believing Wilcox had somehow learned of old material known to my uncle and was deceiving the elderly scholar. The aesthete's accounts, however, told a troubling story. From February 28 to April 2, a substantial number had experienced highly unusual dreams, with intensity vastly greater during the sculptor's delirium. More than a quarter of those reporting described scenes and half-heard sounds resembling Wilcox's visions. Several dreamers admitted acute terror of the colossal nameless entity glimpsed near the end. One case, stressed in the notes, was especially tragic. A well-known architect inclined toward theosophy and occultism went violently insane on the day Wilcox seized and died months later after ceaseless cries to be rescued from some hellish escapee. Had my uncle used names instead of numbers, I might have sought verification and personal inquiry. As it was, I traced only a few, all confirming the notes completely. I often wondered whether all those questioned felt as baffled as this sample. It is fortunate no explanation ever reached them. The newspaper clippings, as mentioned, dealt with cases of panic, mania, and odd behavior during that period. Professor Angel must have used a clipping service, for the volume was enormous and sources worldwide. There was a nighttime suicide in London, a sleeper leaping from a window after a terrifying scream. A rambling letter to a South American newspaper from a fanatic foreseeing doom from visions. A California dispatch about a theosophist colony donning white robes en masse for an expected, glorious fulfillment. That never came, while Indian items cautiously reported serious native unrest late in March. Voodoo ceremonies proliferated in Haiti, African stations noted ominous whispers. American officers in the Philippines found certain tribes troublesome at that time, and New York police were mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22 to 23. Western Ireland brimmed with wild rumors and folklore, and a fanciful painter named Ardwabano exhibited a blasphemous dream landscape at the 1926 Paris Spring Salon. Recorded asylum disturbances were so numerous that only chance prevented medical professionals from noticing eerie parallels and drawing bewildered conclusions. A strange collection overall. Even now I can hardly imagine the rigid rationalism with which I initially dismissed them. But I was then certain young Wilcox had known the older matters referenced by the professor. Chapter 2. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. Those older matters that lent such weight to the sculptor's dream and relief formed the subject of the second half of the lengthy manuscript. It seems Professor Angel had once before encountered the infernal outline of the nameless monstrosity, pondered the unknown hieroglyphs, and heard the sinister syllables pronounceable only as Cthulhu, all in so alarming and dreadful a context that no surprise he pursued young Wilcox so eagerly for information. That earlier encounter occurred in 1908, 17 years prior, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual convention in St. Louis. Professor Angel, fitting his stature and accomplishments, played a leading role in proceedings and was among the first approached by several outsiders attending to pose questions or seek expert opinions. The most prominent of these, and soon the center of attention for the whole gathering, was an ordinary-looking middle-aged man who had traveled from New Orleans seeking specific knowledge unavailable locally. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, a police inspector by occupation. He carried the object of his visit, a grotesque, repellent, and seemingly ancient stone idol of undetermined origin. It should not be assumed Inspector Legras had any interest in archaeology. His motive was purely professional. The idol, or fetish, or whatever it was, had been seized months earlier in wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on an alleged voodoo gathering. The associated rites were so bizarre and hideous that police realized they had uncovered a dark cult entirely unknown to them, far more diabolical than even the worst African voodoo circles. Beyond erratic and incredible stories forced from arrested participants, nothing whatever was learned of its source. Hence the desire for any scholarly insight that might identify the dreadful symbol and thereby trace the cult to its roots. Inspector Legras was hardly prepared for the uproar his exhibit provoked. One glance sufficed to plunge the assembled scholars into tense excitement. They crowded around him to examine the small figure whose utter alienness and aura of profound antiquity suggested vast, uncharted realms. No known sculptural tradition had produced this awful object, yet its dim greenish surface seemed to record centuries, perhaps millennia. The figurine, passed hand to hand for close scrutiny, stood 7 to 8 inches tall and displayed masterful craftsmanship. It depicted a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, octopus-like head with a mass of feelers for a face, scaly rubbery body, enormous claws on hands and feet, and long narrow wings at the back. Radiating fearful unnatural malice, somewhat bloated in form, it squatted malevolently upon a block or pedestal inscribed with indecipherable characters. Wing tips touched the rear edge of the base, the seat occupied the center, while long curved claws of the crouched hind legs gripped the front edge and extended partway down the front. The squid-like head tilted forward so facial tentacles brushed the backs of huge forepaws clasping the raised knees. The whole was abnormally lifelike and all the more disturbing because its origin was wholly unknown. Its immense, awesome, incalculable age was unmistakable, yet it shared no trait with any art of civilization's dawn, or any era. Its very substance was a puzzle. The soapy greenish-black stone flecked with gold or iridescence matched nothing known to geology or mineralogy. The characters on the base were equally baffling. No attendee, representing half the world's expertise, could guess even their distant linguistic family. Like the figure and material, they evoked something horribly remote from humanity, dreadfully hinting at ancient unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and ideas play no part. Yet as scholars shook their heads and admitted defeat, one man recognized a faint bizarre familiarity in the monstrous form and script and hesitantly shared a minor experience. This was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology at Princeton and a respected explorer. 48 years earlier, while searching Greenland and Iceland for runic inscriptions he never found, he had encountered on the West Greenland coast a peculiar degenerate tribe practicing a repulsive form of devil worship that chilled him with its deliberate bloodlust. Other Eskimos knew little of this faith and spoke of it only with shudders, claiming it descended from frightfully ancient times before the world existed. Beyond nameless rites and human sacrifices, it involved strange hereditary ceremonies addressed to a supreme elder devil or Tornasuk. Professor Webb had obtained a careful phonetic transcription of one ritual chant from an aged wizard priest. Of immediate relevance was the fetish revered by this cult, around which they danced when the aurora flared above the ice cliffs. It was, he said, a crude stone relief bearing a monstrous image and cryptic text, and, as far as he could judge, a close parallel in all essential traits to the abomination now before the assembly. This revelation, received with breathless astonishment, electrified Inspector Legras, who began questioning the professor eagerly. Having recorded an oral ritual from the swamp cultists his men had arrested, He urged Webb to recall as much as possible of the syllables noted among the Eskimo devil worshippers. A meticulous comparison followed, culminating in odd silence when detective and scholar agreed the phrases common to two infernal rites separated by half the globe were virtually identical. In essence, what both the Eskimo shamans and Louisiana swamp priests chanted to their idols resembled, with divisions guessed from traditional pauses. Phnglui mglwnaf Cthulhu Ryaoganegelftain. Legrasse held one advantage over Webb. Several of his mixed-race prisoners had explained the words as taught by elders, meaning, in his house at R'lyeh dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. At the urgent general request, Inspector Legrasse then recounted in full detail his encounter with the swamp worshippers, a tale my uncle clearly regarded as profoundly significant. It echoed the wildest fantasies of mythologists and theosophists, revealing astonishing cosmic imagination among the lowliest half-breeds and outcasts. On November 1, 1907, New Orleans police received a desperate call from the swamp and lagoon region southward. The inhabitants, mostly primitive but amiable descendants of Lafitte's pirates, were gripped by terror of something that had crept upon them nocturnally. It seemed voodoo, but voodoo far worse than any they knew. Women and children had vanished since malignant tom-tom drumming began deep in the dark haunted woods no one entered. There were maddened cries, blood-curdling screams, soul-freezing chants, and dancing devil fires. The terrified messenger declared the people could endure no more. Thus 20 officers in 2 carriages and an automobile set out late afternoon, guided by a trembling squatter. At the end of the navigable road they disembarked and trudged miles in silence through dreadful cypress groves where daylight never penetrated. Hideous roots and hanging loops of Spanish moss obstructed them. Occasional mounds of damp stone or crumbling wall fragments deepened the gloom every malformed tree and fungal growth helped create. Finally the squatter village, a wretched cluster of huts, came into view, and hysterical residents rushed to surround the lantern-bearing party. Muffled tom-tom beats were now faintly audible far ahead, an occasional curdling shriek pierced the air when the wind changed. A reddish glow filtered through dense underbrush beyond endless forest avenues. Each frightened squatter flatly refused to advance further toward the unholy rite, so Legrasse and his 19 men plunged unguided into uncharted arcs of terror. The area was notorious for evil legend, virtually unknown to white men. Tales spoke of a hidden lake unseen by mortals wherein dwelt a huge formless white polypus horror with glowing eyes. Squatters whispered bat-winged devils emerged from subterranean caverns to worship it at midnight. It predated D'Iberville, La Salle, the Indians, even healthy beasts and birds of the forest. It was nightmare incarnate. To behold it meant death. Yet it caused dreams, so locals shunned the place. The current voodoo rite occupied only the fringe of this dreaded zone, but even that was sinister enough, perhaps why the site itself terrified squatters more than the sounds and events. Only poetry or madness could capture the sounds Legrasse men heard as they slogged toward the red glow and muffled drums. There are human vocal traits and animal vocal traits. It is horrifying to hear the wrong one. Bestial rage and orgiastic abandon here lashed themselves to demonic frenzy with howls and ecstatic squawks echoing through night woods, like pestilential storms from hell's abyss. Occasionally the chaotic ululation paused, and a drilled chorus of hoarse voices intoned the ghastly phrase, Phnglui mglwnaf Cthulhu Ryaoganegelftain. Reaching a spot where trees thinned, the men suddenly beheld the spectacle. 4 reeled, 1 fainted, 2 shrieked frantically, but the orgy's insane din mercifully drowned the cries. Legrasse splashed swamp water on the unconscious man. All stood trembling, nearly mesmerized by horror. In a natural swamp clearing stood a grassy island roughly an acre across, tree-free and fairly dry. Upon it leaped and writhed an indescribable horde of human grotesquerie no artist save Syme or Angarola could portray. Naked, this hybrid progeny bawled, bellowed, and contorted around a colossal ring-shaped bonfire. Through occasional flame gaps the center revealed an 8-foot granite monolith topped incongruously by the foul-carved idol. From a wide ring of 10 scaffolds centered on the fire-haloed monolith hung, head downward, the strangely mangled bodies of the missing squatters. Within this inner circle the worshippers leaped and roared, moving generally left to right in endless bacchanalia between the rings of bodies and flame. Perhaps imagination or echoes alone made one excitable Spaniard fancy antiphonal responses from some distant unlit spot, deeper in the legendary wood of horror. I later met and questioned this man, Joseph D. Galvez. He proved distressingly imaginative, even hinting at faint vast wing beats, gleaming eyes, and a mountainous white mass beyond the farthest trees, though I assume he had absorbed too much local superstition. The men's horrified pause was brief. Duty prevailed, despite perhaps 100 mongrel celebrants. The police trusted their guns and charged resolutely into the nauseating melee. For 5 minutes pandemonium reigned beyond description, wild blows, gunfire, attempted flights. But eventually Legras secured 47 sullen prisoners, forced them to dress hastily, and lined them between double ranks of officers. 5 cultists lay dead, 2 severely wounded were carried on makeshift stretchers by comrades. The monolith idol was carefully removed and brought back by Legras. Questioned at headquarters after an exhausting journey, the captives proved low, mixed race, and mentally aberrant, mostly seamen with some Negroes and mulattoes, chiefly West Indian or Cape Verde Brava Portuguese, lending a voodoo flavor to the motley cult. Yet it soon emerged that something far older and deeper than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant, they clung with surprising uniformity to the core tenet of their abominable creed. They worshipped, they claimed, the great old ones who lived ages before mankind and descended from the stars to the young earth. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and beneath the sea, but their dead bodies had whispered secrets in dreams to the first humans, who founded a cult that never died. This was that cult, existing forever hidden in remote wastes and dark places worldwide until the great priest Cthulhu rises from his dark house in mighty underwater R'lyeh and again claims dominion over the earth. He would call when the stars were right, the secret cult would always wait to free him. No more must be revealed. There was a secret torture itself could not extract. Humanity was not alone among Earth's conscious beings, for shapes emerged from darkness to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No human had ever seen the old ones. The carved image was great Cthulhu, yet none could say if others resembled him exactly. None now could read the ancient writing, but knowledge passed orally. The chanted ritual was not the true secret, that was whispered only, never spoken aloud. The chant meant merely, in his house at R'lyeh dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 prisoners were sane enough for hanging, the rest were committed to asylums. All denied involvement in the ritual killings, insisting black-winged ones from their ancient haunted wood meeting place had performed them. No coherent account of these allies was ever obtained. What police did learn came chiefly from an extremely old mestizo named Castro, who claimed voyages to strange ports and conversations with immortal cult leaders in China's mountains. Old Castro recalled fragments of hideous lore that dwarfed theosophist speculation and made humanity and the world seem brief and recent. There had been eons when other things ruled the earth and built great cities. Deathless Chinese had told him remains of those Cyclopean stones on Pacific islands still existed. They perished vast epochs before humans arose, but arts existed to revive them when stars returned to proper alignment. They had come from the stars themselves, bringing their images. These great old ones, Castro added, were not wholly flesh and blood. They had form. Did not the star-spawned image prove it? Yet that form was not material. When stars aligned, they could plunge world to world across the sky. When misaligned, they could not live. But though no longer living, they would never truly die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great ones shewed them, idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something had happened. The great stone city R'lyeh, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinamen said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazard which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet. That is not dead which can eternal lie. And with strange eons even death may die. Legras, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro, apparently, had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legras' tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended, although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the Society. Caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Legras for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It is truly a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculptor I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing, after a knowledge of what Legras had learned of the cult, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image and the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by Eskimo diabolists and mongrel Louisianans? Professor Angle's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration, but the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusions. So, after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legras, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculptor and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in the fleur-de-lis building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th-century Breton architecture which flaunts its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded from the specimens scattered about that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams, yet had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They and their subconscious residuum had influenced his art profoundly, and he shewed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream bas-relief, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall, he soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong, and hear with frightened expectancy the ceaseless, half-mental calling from underground, Cthulhu Phtain, Cthulhu Phtain. These words had formed part of that dread ritual which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at R'lyeh, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the bas-relief, and in the terrible statue I now beheld, so that his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type, at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably, and wish him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into its origin and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legrasse and others of that old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Angel. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels, after a careless push from a Negro sailor. I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legrasse and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculptor's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. Chapter 3. The Madness from the Sea. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be a total effacing of the results of a mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain stray piece of shelf paper. It was nothing on which I would naturally have stumbled in the course of my daily round, for it was an old number of an Australian journal, the Sydney Bulletin for April 18, 1925. It had escaped even the cutting bureau which had at the time of its issuance been avidly collecting material for my uncle's research. I had largely given over my inquiries into what Professor Angel called the Cthulhu cult, and was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum and a mineralogist of note. Examining one day the reserve specimens roughly set on the storage shelves in a rear room of the museum, my eye was caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers spread beneath the stones. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, for my friend has wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts, and the picture was a half-tone cut of a hideous stone image almost identical with that which Legrasse had found in the swamp. Eagerly clearing the sheet of its precious contents, I scanned the item in detail, and was disappointed to find it of only moderate length. What it suggested, however, was of portentous significance to my flagging quest, and I carefully tore it out for immediate action. It read as follows. Mystery derelict found at sea. Vigilant arrives with helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. Rescued seaman refuses particulars of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. The Morrison Company's freighter Vigilant, bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning at its wharf in Darling Harbor, having in tow the battled and disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, NZ. which was sighted April 12 in S. latitude 34 degrees 21 minutes W. Longitude 152 degrees 17 minutes with 1 living and 1 dead man aboard. The Vigilant left Valparaiso March 25, and on April 2 was driven considerably south of her course by exceptionally heavy storms and monster waves. On April 12 the derelict was sighted, and though apparently deserted, was found upon boarding to contain 1 survivor in a half-delirious condition and 1 man who had evidently been dead for more than a week. The living man was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin, about a foot in height, regarding whose nature authorities at Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the museum in College Street all profess complete bafflement, and which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht, in a small carved shrine of common pattern. This man, after recovering his senses, told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustav Johansen, a Norwegian of some intelligence, and had been second mate of the 2-masted schooner Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Callao February 20 with a complement of 11 men. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south of her course by the great storm of March 1, and on March 22, in S. latitude 49 degrees 51 minutes W. Longitude 128 degrees 34 minutes, encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes. Being ordered peremptorily to turn back, Captain Collins refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely and without warning upon the schooner with a peculiarly heavy battery of brass cannon forming part of the yacht's equipment. The Emma's men should fight, says the survivor, and though the schooner began to sink from shots beneath the waterline, they managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her, grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck, and being forced to kill them all, the number being slightly superior, because of their particularly abhorrent and desperate though rather clumsy mode of fighting. 3 of the Emma's men, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green, were killed, and the remaining 8 under Second Mate Johansen proceeded to navigate the captured yacht, going ahead in their original direction to see if any reason for their ordering back had existed. The next day, it appears, they raised and landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore, though Johansen is queerly reticent about this part of his story, and speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm. Later, it seems, he and 1 companion boarded the yacht and tried to manage her, but were beaten about by the storm of April 2. From that time till his rescue on the 12th the man remembers little, and he does not even recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. Bryden's death reveals no apparent cause, and was probably due to excitement or exposure. Cable advices from Dunedin report that the Alert was well known there as an island trader, and bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. It was owned by a curious group of half-castes whose frequent meetings and night trips to the woods attracted no little curiosity, and it had set sail in great haste just after the storm and earth tremors of March 1. Our Auckland correspondent gives the Emma and her crew an excellent reputation, and Johansen is described as a sober and worthy man. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter beginning tomorrow, at which every effort will be made to induce Johansen to speak more freely than he has done hitherto. This was all, together with the picture of the hellish image, but what a train of ideas it started in my mind. Here were new treasuries of data on the Cthulhu cult, and evidence that it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. What motive prompted the hybrid crew to order back the Emma as they sailed about with their hideous idol? What was the unknown island on which 6 of the Emma's crew had died, and about which the mate Johansen was so secretive? What had the Vice-Admiralty's investigation brought out, and what was known of the noxious cult in Dunedin? And most marvelous of all, what deep and more than natural linkage of dates was this which gave a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turns of events so carefully noted by my uncle? March 1st, or February 28th according to the international date line, the earthquake and storm had come. From Dunedin the Alert and her noisome crew had darted eagerly forth as if imperiously summoned, and on the other side of the earth poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank cyclopean city whilst a young sculptor had moulded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. March 23d the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island and left 6 men dead, and on that date the dreams of sensitive men assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a giant monster's malign pursuit, whilst an architect had gone mad and a sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what of this storm of April 2nd, the date on which all dreams of the dank city ceased, and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of strange fever? What of all this, and of those hints of old Castro about the sunken, star-born old ones and their coming reign, their faithful cult and their mastery of dreams? Was I tottering on the brink of cosmic horrors beyond man's power to bear? If so, they must be horrors of the mind alone, for in some way the 2nd of April had put a stop to whatever monstrous menace had begun its siege of mankind's soul. That evening, after a day of hurried cabling and arranging, I bade my host adieu and took a train for San Francisco. In less than a month I was in Dunedin, where, however, I found that little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns. Waterfront scum was far too common for special mention, though there was vague talk about one inland trip these mongrels had made, during which faint drumming and red flame were noted on the distant hills. In Auckland I learned that Johansen had returned with yellow hair turned white after a perfunctory and inconclusive questioning at Sydney, and had thereafter sold his cottage in West Street and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of his stirring experience he would tell his friends no more than he had told the Admiralty officials, and all they could do was to give me his Oslo address. After that I went to Sydney and talked profitlessly with seamen and members of the Vice-Admiralty Court. I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use, at Circular Quay in Sydney Cove, but gained nothing from its noncommittal bulk. The crouching image with its cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings, and hieroglyphed pedestal, was preserved in the museum at Hyde Park, and I studied it long and well, finding it a thing of balefully exquisite workmanship, and with the same utter mystery, terrible antiquity, and unearthly strangeness of material which I had noted in Legrasse' smaller specimen. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle, for they vowed that the world held no rock like it. Then I thought with a shudder of what old Castro had told Legrasse about the primal great ones. They had come from the stars, and had brought their images with them. Shaken with such a mental revolution as I had never before known, I now resolved to visit mate Johansen in Oslo. Sailing for London, I re-embarked at once for the Norwegian capital, and one autumn day landed at the trim wharves in the shadow of the Egeberg. Johansen's address, I discovered, lay in the old town of King Harald Hardrada, which kept alive the name of Oslo during all the centuries that the greater city masqueraded as Christiana. I made the brief trip by taxicab, and knocked with palpitant heart at the door of a neat and ancient building with plastered front. A sad-faced woman in black answered my summons, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustav Johansen was no more. He had not survived his return, said his wife, for the doings at sea in 1925 had broken him. He had told her no more than he had told the public, but had left a long manuscript, of technical matters, as he said, written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the peril of casual perusal. During a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. 2 Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him he was dead. Physicians found no adequate cause for the end, and laid it to heart trouble and a weakened constitution. I now felt gnawing at my vitals that dark terror which will never leave me till I, too, am at rest, accidentally or otherwise. Persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscript, I bore the document away and began to read it on the London boat. It was a simple, rambling thing, a naive sailor's effort at a post facto diary, and strove to recall day by day that last awful voyage. I cannot attempt to transcribe it verbatim in all its cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell its gist enough to shew why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. Johansen, thank God, did not know quite all, even though he saw the city and the thing, but I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in time and in space, and of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favored by a nightmare cult ready and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air. Johansen's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice-Admiralty. The Emma, in ballast, had cleared Auckland on February 20th, and had felt the full force of that earthquake-born tempest which must have heaved up from the sea bottom the horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress when held up by the Alert on March 22nd, and I could feel the mate's regret as he wrote of her bombardment and sinking. Of the swarthy cult fiends on the Alert he speaks with significant horror. There was some peculiarly abominable quality about them which made their destruction seem almost a duty, and Johansen shews ingenuous wonder at the charge of ruthlessness brought against his party during the proceedings of the Court of Inquiry. Then, driven ahead by curiosity in their captured yacht under Johansen's command, the men sight a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea, and in S. latitude 47 degrees 9 minutes, W. longitude 126 degrees 43 minutes come upon a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of R'lyeh, that was built in measureless eons behind history by the vast, loathsome shapes that seeped down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in green slimy vaults and sending out at last, after cycles incalculable, the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive and called imperiously to the faithful to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. All this Johansen did not suspect, but God knows he soon saw enough. I suppose that only a single mountain top, the hideous monolith-crowned citadel whereon great Cthulhu was buried, actually emerged from the waters. When I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there I almost wish to kill myself forthwith. Johansen and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of this dripping Babylon of elder demons, and must have guessed without guidance that it was nothing of this or of any sane planet. Awe at the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks, at the dizzying height of the great carven monolith, and at the stupefying identity of the colossal statues and bas-reliefs with the queer image found in the shrine on the Alert, is poignantly visible in every line of the mate's frightened description. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansen achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city, for instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces, surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mention his talk about angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He had said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unlettered seaman felt the same thing whilst gazing at the terrible reality. Johansen and his men landed at a sloping mud bank on this monstrous acropolis, and clambered slipperily up over Titan oozy blocks which could have been no mortal staircase. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out from this sea-soaked perversion, and twisted menace and suspense lurked leeringly in those crazily elusive angles of carven rock where a second glance shewed concavity after the first shewed convexity. Something very like fright had come over all the explorers before anything more definite than rock and ooze and weed was seen. Each would have fled had he not feared the scorn of the others, and it was only half-heartedly that they searched, vainly, as it proved, for some portable souvenir to bear away. It was Rodriguez the Portuguese who climbed up the foot of the monolith and shouted of what he had found. The rest followed him, and looked curiously at the immense carved door with the now familiar squid dragon bas-relief. It was, Johansen said, like a great barn door, and they all felt that it was a door because of the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result. Then Donovan felt over it delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone molding, that is, one would call it climbing if the thing was not after all horizontal, and the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. Then, very softly and slowly, the acre-great panel began to give inward at the top, and they saw that it was balanced. Donovan slid or somehow propelled himself down or along the jamb and rejoined his fellows, and everyone watched the queer recession of the monstrously carven portal. In this fantasy of prismatic distortion it moved anomalously in a diagonal way, so that all the rules of matter and perspective seemed upset. The aperture was black with a darkness almost material. That tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its aeon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping membranous wings. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he heard a nasty, slopping sound down there. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening still when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poisoned city of madness. Poor Johansen's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks 2 perished of pure fright in that accursed instant. The thing cannot be described, there is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God! What wonder that across the earth a great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in that telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green, sticky spawn of the stars, had awaked to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again and ravening for delight. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anybody turned. God rest them, if there be any rest in the universe. They were Donovan, Guerrera, and Angstrom. Parker slipped as the other 3 were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas of green-crusted rock to the boat, and Johansson swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there, an angle which was acute, but behaved as if it were obtuse. So only Bryden and Johansson reached the boat, and pulled desperately for the Alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated, floundering at the edge of the water. Steam had not been suffered to go down entirely, despite the departure of all hands for the shore, and it was the work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down between wheel and engines to get the Alert under way. Slowly, amidst the distorted horrors of that indescribable scene, she began to churn the lethal waters, whilst on the masonry of that charnel shore that was not of earth the Titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered like Polypheme, cursing the fleeing ship of Odysseus. Then, bolder than the storied Cyclops, great Cthulhu slid greasily into the water and began to pursue with vast wave-raising strokes of cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went mad, laughing shrilly as he kept on laughing at intervals till death found him one night in the cabin whilst Johansson was wandering deliriously. But Johansson had not given out yet. Knowing that the thing could surely overtake the Alert until steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and, setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck and reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming in the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian drove his vessel head on against the pursuing jelly which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a demon galleon. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansson drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 opened graves, and a sound that the chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled by an acrid and blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething astern, where, God in heaven, the scattered plasticity of that nameless skyspawn was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, whilst its distance widened every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mounting steam. That was all. After that Johansson only brooded over the idol in the cabin and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. He did not try to navigate after the first bold flight, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. Then came the storm of April 2nd, and a gathering of the clouds about his consciousness. There is a sense of spectral whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides through reeling universes on a comet's tail, and of hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon and from the moon back again to the pit, all livened by a cachinnating chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green, bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. Out of that dream came rescue, the Vigilant, the Vice-Admiralty Court, the streets of Dunedin, and the long voyage back home to the old house by the Egeberg. He could not tell, they would think him mad. He would write of what he knew before death came, but his wife must not guess. Death would be a boon if only it could blot out the memories. That was the document I read, and now I have placed it in the tin box beside the bas-relief and the papers of Professor Angel. With it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. But I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, so I shall go. I know too much, and the cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives, too, I suppose, again in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the Vigilance sailed over the spot after the April storm. But his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think. Let me pray that, if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity and see that it meets no other eye. Thank you for listening.